Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, bringing you the best in discussion, debate, and analysis each and every day, but especially on Wednesday night with our 3 live streams culminated by Ohio State Talk at 9 o'clock Eastern time. So again, everybody spread the word, and let's get Buckeye Nation on here each and every week for us. So I've got a dilemma here. I got to make predictions here in about 40 minutes. And so I've got these are not my final predictions. These are my projections from the spring. So this is going way back in the spring just to try to give myself a feel for, and if you're trying to drive views on YouTube, yeah, you go with, these are my, just after New Year's Day predictions for next year. And then you do the projections, spring projections. Then you get like a third wave of predictions. You do it like that. I was going 10-2 and 7-2 in the Big Ten for the Buckeyes. And I know that that's right teetering on, that 11-1, 10-2 separation will mean everything for this team. Most likely, of course, they missed the playoffs with one loss last year, but most likely that's the separation right there. The one loss versus the 2 loss. And in the eyes of Buckeye Nation, that's going to be success, or it's ridiculous to state failure. Right, Kevin?
Oh yeah. I mean, heck, 11-1. There's going to be some disappointed people there if they drop one game. There's a big difference there, because I think a lot of people are operating probably in that 11-1 space, maybe missing the playoff again, going back out to the Rose Bowl, but getting out to Indianapolis. A second loss. Especially a second league loss. That's just, that's unfamiliar ground for fans through the Urban Meyer days. You lose 9 games overall during your 7-year tenure with the Buckeyes. People are not used to that. So there certainly is something to be said that if they somehow doink off a couple of losses this year, I think that this team, all signs point to 2020 being a really special year. But I think we can also say that this, Ohio State through the last generation always seems to be their year is always the year before the one that they arrive. 14 was building up to 15, and they win the title in 14. I think a lot of people were expecting stuff the year after they won it with Tressel and won against Miami out in the desert. So, with everybody circling to 2020, 19 could be a special year.
According to Yardvark's Lawn Care, I'm the James Brown of college football. Very nice. So there is going to be a year, and Auburn almost pulled it off 2 years ago, where the 2-loss team does make the playoff. I believe that's going to happen, and happen fairly soon. But the reason it probably won't for Ohio State is, number one, it's going to happen, and I'm stealing Steve's line probably here, it's going to happen for the SEC before it happens for anyone, just because of there's favoritism there in the selection process. Number two, it's because of the non-conference schedule. So if Ohio State could, let's say they lost 2 really close games in the Big Ten. Let's say the Big Ten was just looking very strong. They lost on the road to Nebraska, and they lost on the road to Michigan State by 3 points each. But they went out and beat an Oklahoma during the non-conference slate. Well, the 10-2 with the 11-2 with the championship game win in the Big Ten may be enough, but with this non-conference slate, 11-1 seems to have to be a must to get in.
Well, especially since they let the genie out of the bottle of 2 teams from the same conference being able to get into the playoff and take 2 of the 4 slots, and obviously the love affair with the SEC. And I know that every year we have a different committee down there in Grapevine, Texas, but it seems like they keep passing, the same playbook to one another, that the SEC just really is a different tier at this point. And I just, I don't see any way that a 2-loss team, especially a 2-loss Big Ten team is going to get the nod when the Big Ten champion the last 2 seasons couldn't even really legitimately sniff the playoff.
I think there's also the factor that losses in the Big Ten confirm that the top of the conference is not as good as the rest of the nation. Losses in the SEC confirm that the bottom of the SEC is as good as any other top of any conference. So it depends on what you want those losses to mean. And quite often in the SEC, losses just mean that this is really tough. These are really hard games. Losses on the road to Iowa and Purdue, those are blowouts, so they're different. But losses in the Big Ten just prove that you're not quite good enough to make the playoffs.
Well, they
So
did
we're-
get into the playoff with the 3-point loss at Penn State and didn't win the Big Ten that year. They did get into the playoff with that. It's who you lose to and how you lose to them. If Ohio State's one loss this year is Nebraska, and Nebraska turns out to be a top 20 team, that won't sting quite as bad as Iowa and Purdue, and particularly if it is a one touchdown game or whatever, something like that. It's the nature of the loss when you are down double digits early and never really even mount a comeback to get into the game. And that looks bad, particularly when both games were night games on national television. I mean, every game that they play is on national television, but in a highlight position, it's who you played and how you played that took them out of the running. Again, they were able to withstand a loss to Penn State that was a close one, and Penn State was unranked, although they went on and won the Big Ten and went to the Rose Bowl that season. They ended up being a pretty good team, probably 10 wins. But to me, I think that's what you have to look for as you go into this season. They can't go out. Northwestern's been my whipping boy. I think they're going to be 2-3 or 1-4 when Ohio State gets there. Ohio State can't go out there and lose that game to a Northwestern team with a losing record and expect to get anything at the end of the season, because if it's a close call, the tie isn't going to go to that runner. So that's kind of my thought.
Okay, everybody. William Lee is telling us that Steve is very rational. I don't know what William is saying about the rest of us, but I think that's a knock on the rest of us. But Claire, we'll go to you. So in regards to, and I think Steve actually alluded to this a few weeks ago in unveiling his predictions. So Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. You picked Nebraska to win the West. So if Ohio State's able to accomplish what Oklahoma did last year, and if that's their loss, but they avenged the loss on a neutral field, then all is forgiven.
Come on in. Yes, that would be a good recipe. The Oklahoma model worked last year, but the difference between them and Ohio State last year and Ohio State the year before was Ohio State the year before had 2 losses, and then last year was a bad loss to a team that ended up 6-7. So measure it any way you want, but that was the rationale in that.
Luke, I'm going to answer your question for you. The last time Purdue won the Big Ten was in 2000 with Drew Brees at quarterback. He threw a long touchdown against Ohio State and West Lafayette to win the game, and then Ohio State lost to Michigan. There was a 2 or 3 way tie for the championship. Yeah, Purdue went to the Rose Bowl that year. That's the last time they won the Big Ten. Claire, what about this playoff mess or anything you want to take off on? I will mention, and you don't need to speak to this, but, and this is nothing we don't all know, but it just kind of hit me again this week when I saw the number 71st rated defense in 2018 following going something in the range of 4, 6, and 9 the 3 previous season in national defensive rankings. Ohio State was easily in the top 10 for 3 consecutive years in what that would have been 15, 16, and 17, and then all the way to 71st. That's just incredible with those kind of athletes on the field that could have gone on for 14 games.
So, my addition kind of to what everybody else said, Kevin talked about letting the genie out of the bottle, and he's right that because this is still a new process, they're setting the precedents as they go along. Because there are still loopholes in the system. So, obviously I agree with Steve that Ohio State definitely benefited from that very first genie coming out of the bottle and not winning the conference championship. But it definitely it is a moving target. It makes it more difficult for these committee members to actually make rational decisions as these precedents start stacking up on each other, though. So they can now point to and say, what if, like they're lawyers. So that part is difficult for Ohio State. But the progression of the season, and it goes back to a little bit of what Steve was talking about earlier, And what we kind of talked about a couple weeks ago is, they're talking about culture in this team, and it definitely appears like it's a very optimistic, very positive culture around the team. We know that Ohio State teams historically have done better when they have something to prove, aka 2014 versus 2015. And I truly believe that culture definitely makes a difference. We talked about Penn State possibly having a culture problem, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they're underperforming. But I think culture is going to be what ends up bridging a gap in a game that maybe they shouldn't be in, or a game where they've got to come back from something that seems insurmountable, or they're almost taking an L from an Iowa or Purdue. So I truly believe that the intangibles are where that really the rubber meets the road on there. So the only problem with culture and optimism is we can't say it's optimism until the season is over. Otherwise, it just looks like these coaches were myopic. So they didn't see the forest for the trees. So we can say it's optimistic, and they most likely are, and most likely it's something to boost morale on the team. But we definitely have to stay realistic as fans.